Good morning, or good afternoon. It is a pleasure today to introduce to all of you Michael McCarthy. He's a very good friend of mine. We started together, me as a student, he as a teacher. He's older, obviously. So anyway, but it's, Mike has been coming to Valencia. He's been here many times, but it's been a while since his last time here. So it's an immense pleasure to have him here. And I'm sure you're going to enjoy his lecture very much. Let me just introduce Mike, the official part of the introduction. Michael McCarthy is Emeritus Professor of Applied Linguistics in the School of English, University of Nottingham, UK. He holds or has held visiting professorships at the University of Limerick, Ireland, Newcastle University, UK, and Penn State University, USA. He's also, believe it or not, an honorary professor of the University of Valencia, Spain, that is our university. He has been involved in the study and teaching of English for more than 50 years. For the last 30 years, he has worked with large computerized corpora of English texts, investigating them to establish how the vocabulary and grammar of English are really used at the present time and how they are evolving and changing. His research has focused on everyday spoken English, which is what he's been going to talk to you about. He's author of more than 50 books and 109 academic papers, and many more that I know he's hidden in his house, but doesn't want to show anyone, dealing with research and teaching of the English language, especially as a second or foreign language. He has taught in the UK, the Netherlands, Spain, Sweden, and Malaysia, 46 different countries. He's a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts, and his latest book, English Grammar, Your Questions Answered. This was my idea to show it to you. Yeah. Was published this year independently because he was an author of a publishing house for many years. He has a few copies with him, and he's happy to sign these copies for you after his lecture, and you can buy them for, 10 euros?
It's cheaper than
online. Yeah, true. Okay, I'll let Mike do the talking. Thank you.
Well, first of all, let me check that everybody can hear clearly at the back. Okay, good. Well, it's a great privilege to be back here in Valencia. And Carmina mentioned that I work with corpora of English texts. And the biggest corpus that I developed was a corpus called CanCode. And I developed it with my colleague, Ronald Carter. And it was mentally conceived, here in Valencia. We wanted to escape from this faculty for a few minutes, and we went for a walk in a nearby park. And we were walking around, this was 1991, I think it was, 1991, before she was born. And, and we had this idea that we would develop a corpus of ordinary, everyday English conversation. So we developed that during the 1990s, and it's still ongoing now. So thank you, Valencia, for the idea. Now, today we're going to talk specifically about spoken grammar. And the title is 20 Years On. Where are we now? And the reason it's 20 years on, it's actually more correctly 22 years on, because in 1995, Ronald Carter and I published an article in the journal Applied Linguistics on spoken grammar. And we were very excited, and the whole world just yawned, okay? They weren't terribly excited. You probably know the word overwhelmed. Well, the world was underwhelmed, okay? So it took a number of years to persuade people that spoken grammar was a direction in which to go, because everyone just said, well, what's special about spoken grammar? It's just slang. It's just the language of teenagers. It's just the language of the street. We can't teach that kind of language. We can't really seriously study that kind of language. So today I hope to show you how important it is from the point of view of researchers, from the point of view of those who create materials for teaching English, and from the point of view of all of us who use English, whether we are native speakers or, like yourselves, expert users. We're going to start by looking at a piece of spoken English. This is a transcript of an educated native speaker of English. I hope you can see it. I'll read it anyway. And this is what he said. I suppose, I don't know, when my sister and I were children, we had a small little sort of patch, you know, kind of a little bit tucked away at the back of somewhere and then he names the place where he lived, but we protect the anonymity of our subjects, so that was the name of his place where he lived. And we used to grow tomatoes and the odd vegetables and things. Now, what I've highlighted here are some interesting grammatical phenomena. Imagine that you come into a room and you say, hello, I suppose. I suppose. Now, in the mind of everybody is, you suppose what? What is it that you suppose? But nobody here says, what do you suppose? Okay? And he says, I don't know. And imagine again, you come into a room and you say, I don't know. Everybody is thinking, what is it that this person doesn't know? So these pieces of language in traditional grammar, they must have an object. You have to know something. You have to suppose something. In spoken grammar, they don't need that object. You can just say, I suppose, I don't know. And that's how he starts. Then he says, little sort of patch, you know, kind of. Now, what's the grammar here? There's no proper syntax. It's just little pieces of language put together one after the other in real time, online, as it were. And then he says, and we used to grow tomatoes and the odd vegetable and things. And things? And the other people didn't say, what things? Things you smoke or what, you know? So everybody understands what this person means when he says the odd vegetable and things. Nobody thinks, perhaps he grows, you know, mangoes or bananas. No, because this is in England and we know that we don't grow mangoes or bananas. We know that it will be rather boring things like carrots and apples and maybe, I don't know. So these are all part of what we call the grammar of conversation. These phenomena you will not find in academic writing. If you write your essay in English for your professor and you say, Shakespeare wrote some interesting dramas and things. I don't know, I suppose Shakespeare is the greatest English poet. If you wrote that, it would be very strange. So these are features of the grammar of spoken English. Now we're going to come back to this speaker later, okay? Just hold it in your mind, keep it in your heads. Now we're going to go into the more academic side of things. We're going to look, first of all, at some of the things that scholars, researchers, academics have said about spoken grammar. And first thing, a very wonderful man called David Brazil. It's spelt the same as the country, but it's pronounced Brazil. David Brazil in 1995 said, and I'll read it because it's not very clear, we do not necessarily have to assume that the consideration of such abstract notions as sentences enters into the user's scheme of things at all. What this means is when we are speaking in conversation with our friends, with our family, with our colleagues, we are not thinking in sentences. Okay, so you don't say, capital G, good morning, comma, capital H, how are you today, question mark. Okay, we're not thinking like that. The sentence is not a reality for the speaker. What is real for the speaker is phrases, small clauses. If you look at a transcript of conversation, nobody speaks for a long time. Only the most boring person speaks for more than about 5 seconds. It really is very short pieces of language. So the sentence, we're going to kick it out. We're going to say goodbye to the sentence. And if I use the word sentence during the rest of my talk, you can all shout and say, stop it. Okay? No mention of sentences. That was David Brazil. In Carter and McCarthy, that's me and my colleague Ronald Carter in 1995, we found that common pieces of grammar, common features of grammar, which we found in conversation, were rare. Sometimes you didn't find them at all in writing, or they had a different function in writing from what they have in conversation. And I'll show you some examples in a moment. In 1999, Douglas Biber and his colleagues in the University of Arizona, in Flagstaff, Arizona, they did a major study where they had 4 types of texts. They had fiction, novels and so on, newspapers, academic writing, and conversation. And the one type of language which was most different from all the others was conversation. So there were similarities between newspapers and novels and academic writing, but the one that was very different, statistically different, was conversation. So this is the evidence. This is what people were finding in the 1990s. Finally, one last quotation. The late, great Jeffrey Leach, who died only a couple of years ago and is sadly missed, Jeffrey Leach in 2000 said this: often conversational data, it is conversational data that is different from the rest. Conversation reflects online, linear nature, in brevity of utterances. Okay, so it's online. It's like real time. It's linear. It is not hierarchical. It's not like a pyramid. It's more like a train with coaches, which are joined one after the other in a line, and it comes out piece by piece. Brevity of utterances, short utterances. Now, this is a lecture. I'm going to speak for, 45 minutes. Imagine if we were having a coffee together, and I said, I'm going to tell you about my holiday. It's going to take about 45 minutes, and you will remain quiet while I tell you. And then I'm going to tell you about my hairdresser, and that will take 15 minutes, but I don't want you to speak during that time. That would not be conversation. So conversation, brevity of utterances. Phrases rather than long clauses or heavily embedded structures. All right? Okay. Now then, let's now have a look at some features, some real features of conversation. I'm not going to show you everything. I'm going to show you about 3 or 4 important features, some core features, features which are at the core of spoken grammar. The first one I'm going to look at, here's a nice piece of terminology for you, is co-construction. It means doing things together, building language together. And it's based on work which I did with a very good Chinese linguist, Hong-Yin Tao, in 2001, and with a very good Irish linguist, Brian Clancy, in 2015. So I've had 2 goes at it. I've come back to it. Now I'm going to show you a bit of conversation. The conversation takes place among students, like yourselves here at this university, young people in the University of Limerick in Ireland, okay? And the first student says, so I've no lectures. I'll try and do it in an Irish accent. Let's see. So I've no lectures. I have to do the research myself. And another student says, you have to do it yourself. And the first student says, which is harder, like? Which is harder? And then another student, a different student, says, which would be very difficult, I'd say. And the first one says, yeah. Now then, what is remarkable about this? Okay, what we have here is an interesting phenomenon. These 2 clauses in highlight, in yellow, which is harder, like, which would be very difficult, they are subordinate clauses. They are what we call which clauses. They are which clauses which add a comment. Sometimes we call them comment clauses, okay? That people use them to give their opinion, to evaluate, to give a comment. The interesting thing is that when in 3B the second student says, which would be very difficult, I'd say, the first one doesn't say, who do you think you are butting into my sentence? This is my sentence. You make your own sentences with it, subordinate clauses. You stay out of my sentence. No, because what we were calling sentences, which we got rid of, now we shall call them utterances. The utterance is constructed jointly. It looks like a sentence, but it involves more than one person. And this co-construction, not only is it important, but it's very easy. It's very, very easy. Now I'll tell you an anecdote. I studied Spanish in England at a university, very famous university, the most famous university in England, which does not begin with the letter O, okay? I studied Spanish literature. I'm very proud of the fact that I read everything from, the Siglo de Oro, Cervantes, Lorca, Machado, I don't know, everybody, right up till the modern era. And then I came to Spain. As a young man, I had two objectives. One was to improve my Spanish. The other was to meet as many interesting young Spanish ladies as possible. Now, I succeeded a little bit in the first goal, and I failed hopelessly in the second. The reason I failed in the second was, every time I spoke, I didn't really connect with the other person. And this is a serious point. What this enables you to do is to hook your language onto the language of the other person, to connect, to create what we call flow, okay? To create a conversational flow, like a river, like water. It's not he speaks, I speak, she speaks, I speak, he speaks, I speak. It's not like that. It's like a river, where one person ends and the next person begins, is connected, always connected in some way. This is what the word fluency means. The word fluency comes from the Latin verb fluere, which means to flow, like water. And that's your goal. Your goal in conversation is to create this flow. If you studied geography, you may be familiar with the term confluence, when two rivers come together and make one river. Geographers call it confluence. And that's the goal of conversation, is to create that flow, that continuity. You can do it with which, okay? So I might say to you, hey, this beer only cost €1. You say, which is very cheap, yeah? I mean, you could say, that is very cheap. It would be correct, perfect grammar, perfect vocabulary, but it would lack, it would be missing that hook, that flow. This beer only costs €1, which is really cheap. You can do it with which, you can do it with if. So let's go to the beach tomorrow, if it's fine. Yeah? That little connection, so subordinate clauses, what we call subordinate clauses in English, if clauses, when clauses, which clauses, all of those exist in spoken language in order to help you to connect with what the other person has just said. So forget all those horrors, those nightmares of 3 types of conditional with if. It was a nightmare for me when I studied Spanish. The worst nightmare for anyone speaking Spanish is to start a sentence with, si yo hubiera sabido. It's like a tunnel. How do I get out of this? Where's the escape route? What comes next? It's like a nightmare, isn't it? Okay, that's true about writing. But in speaking, if, these little words like if, their most important function is to enable me to connect with you. So that's my first point, co-construction. And it's useful because it facilitates interpersonal bonding. It creates relationships. It enables you to negotiate meaning, to agree on what you're talking about. Yeah, we'll go to the beach tomorrow. If it's raining. If not, I'm not going. So you're negotiating your positions and your meaning. And it creates this flow, this confluence. Okay, let's move on to the next feature. I've mentioned that these clauses like if and when and which, traditionally they are called subordinate clauses. But we have seen in this example that they can stand alone. They don't need a sentence. They are what we call in spoken grammar freestanding clauses. Yeah? Freestanding clauses. And there are hundreds of examples of this. We have an example in our data. Someone comes into the office and says, "Is Teresa here today?" And the other person says, "No, I don't think so." And the first person says, "Because I want to speak to her. Because I want to speak to her. Because I want to speak to her." Now, if you think of that in the traditional way, a clause with because, cause and effect, cause and result, it doesn't work. Yeah? I want to speak to Teresa whether she is in the office or not in the office. That's what it means. It doesn't mean Teresa must be here today because I want to speak to her. I can conjure her up. Because I want to speak to her, she will appear like a ghost in the office. It's not like that. So freestanding clauses are a part of spoken English. Don't be afraid to just say, "if you like," or "if it's convenient to you." You may go to an office or a company, and the receptionist will say, "If you'd follow me," and you don't say, "What? What if I follow you?" "If you'd sign here, please." "What? What if I sign here? Are you going to take the money out of my bank account? What?" No, these are normal things. "If you'd sign here, please. If you'd follow me, please. Yeah? If you don't mind." Freestanding clauses, they're very important. They facilitate natural phrasal clausal construction instead of these embedded hierarchical sentences. Okay? They create a natural system of turn-taking. You don't have to wait for the main clause, for the matrix clause. You know, you don't sit there silently saying, "Well, he hasn't used a main clause yet, I can't speak. I'll have to wait till there's a main clause." It may never come. And it takes that focus away from the idea of the sentence. So spoken grammar becomes all about phrases, clauses, not creating beautiful, well-formed sentences. Moving on. I want to talk a little bit now about how people use the tense and aspect system of English. A tense means how we talk about time. And English only has two ways of talking about time: the present and the past. We don't have a future tense like Spanish or a conditional tense. We have to create it by using words like will or shall or going to or may or whatever. So that's tense. It's the present tense and the past tense. Aspect is the speaker's perspective on time. So in English, as in Spanish, we have a progressive or continuous aspect. Yeah? I'm speaking about spoken grammar at this moment, etc. That's an example of aspect. And it's exactly the same in Spanish. We have perfect aspect, we have continuous or progressive aspect, and simple aspect. Now, you've learnt all that, and there are rules for that in writing, but what about in speech? Let's have a look at some examples. This is from a recording of a telephone call by a customer to a travel agent, and the customer says, "Hello, we were wanting to book a trip to Sardinia." And the travel agent doesn't say, "Well, why are you ringing me if you don't want to anymore?" You were wanting. Well, have you changed your mind? Why have you changed your mind? No, of course not. This is two steps back from being in someone's face, okay? You can say, "I want to book a trip to Sardinia, and you better give it to me immediately or I'm leaving." That's one way of doing it. You can take one step back and use the past tense. I wanted. You can take two steps back and say, "I was wanting." And that's what they've done here. They've taken two steps away from being very direct, very impolite, very in your face, as we say, yeah? Here's another one. I took my jacket, I think it was this jacket, I took it to the cleaners, put it down on the counter, and the assistant said, "What was the name?" And I said, "The same as yesterday. Haven't changed it." I haven't got married or anything, you know. So, of course, that's not what she means. She really means, what is your name? But the was makes it more polite, more friendly, less in my face. And here's a good one. This one interests me. This is from our data. Sally was telling me they're moving to Birmingham. Now, when you study English, one of the things you learn is about reported speech, okay, how to do it. You know, Sally says, we're moving to Birmingham, and you have to change it to Sally said she was moving to Birmingham. You know, you have to change the tenses and all that. Sally said, Sally told me, the president reported, the prime minister claimed, yeah? The member of parliament asked. But in conversation, we have more than 280 examples of this continuous aspect. Sally was telling me. I was reading in the paper the other day. Our postman was saying that they're going to stop delivering on Saturdays. Yeah? So what is this? Why do we use this continuous, past continuous aspect here? So you can go to the big grammar reference books, these huge grammars of English, all of them published before 2006. Right? And you will not find this in those grammar books. You will not find a single example of this phenomenon. But it's very common. It exists in Spanish too, doesn't it? Sally me decía que, yeah? Sally me dijo que, Sally me decía que. Okay, so it's the same phenomenon. What's it for? What do we use it for? We use it when we have some news that we want to tell someone. It's a little flag. It's a little way of saying, I've got something interesting to tell you. And we always find it at the beginning of topics, of new topics. And it means, pay attention. I have a little bit, you know, I have some interesting news. I have a little bit of scandal, a little bit of gossip. It's a signal that something important is coming. And we don't do it in writing. You do not open a British newspaper and find, the Prime Minister was saying in the House of Commons the other day that they're going to change the law. No, it's always the Prime Minister said, the Prime Minister stated. But in conversation, use this continuous, past continuous aspect, and you are saying to your listener, I have something interesting to tell you. Listen, because this is going to be interesting. It's a topic marker, which is very characteristic of the spoken language, but not of the written. So people exploit the tense and aspect to create appropriate relationships. That's what it's for. It's the same in Spanish, it's the same in every language I've tried to learn, certainly the same in Swedish, which I learned, and it's a very, very important way of using the language. My students, typically, if they came to my office, they would always say, I wanted to ask you a question. That's the characteristic way of addressing a professor. But sometimes we would get students, you know, who are perhaps not familiar with the culture and with the language, who say, I want to ask you a question. And it's sort of, it feels a bit, you know, well, I'm busy at the moment, you know. But the student who says, I wanted to ask you a question, say, yes, of course, come in. You know, it does make a difference. It's only a small point, but it makes a huge difference. It's important because they facilitate politeness and indirectness. They facilitate good relations. They facilitate your perspective on time and reality, your personal subjective view of the situation. Okay, now on we go. Am I going too fast? Yes? Someone says yes. I'll slow down a bit. Okay. No, I'll try to speak a little bit slower. No, that's fair enough. If I was sitting there listening to Spanish, I'm sure I would think, I can't understand this, it's stupid. You mean you want to make notes there? You can have the whole talk afterwards. Yes, of course, yeah. Yeah, no, don't worry about notes. I'm happy to leave the presentation with the faculty, okay? So relax, enjoy it. Good. Thank you. No, thank you for that intervention. That's very important. Don't be afraid, to speak out. I'm not a monster. I won't bite your head off. Now, the next thing we're going to look at is called situational ellipsis, based on work by, myself and Ronald Carter in 2006, and by two wonderful linguists who I work with in the University of Cambridge in England, Andrew Keynes and Paula Buttery, who published on this in 2010. Now, all of these references, your tutors, your professors can give you. And if they can't, you should ask them why. No, they're well-known references anyway. So what is situational ellipsis? I'll show you some examples. Ready yet? Okay. Not are you ready yet, just ready yet? So the are is not there. You talking to me? Instead of are you talking to me? In fact, that is the title of the article by Andrew Keynes. It's called You Talking to Me? Okay. And here's a good one. This is one that my wife said to me when we were assembling a piece of, this furniture which you buy and it's flat and you have to put it together and you're holding it and you're trying to do this. And she said, hammer, please. And I thought, what does she want me to do? Hit her on the head? So how do I know that what she wanted was, pass me the hammer, please? I know it because of the situation. And the simple truth is this, that when language is attached closely to action, we don't need very much language. We don't need much grammar, okay? So the grammar is 100% related to action, to what you're doing. So when people are cooking, when they're driving, when they're making furniture, when they're doing things, moving, arranging the furniture for a conference, putting these posters on here, checking the technology and so on, you need very little language. It's a very famous story. The study of language in action, as it's called, goes back many years, back to the 1960s, when tape recorders were a bit primitive. We didn't have iPhones. We had these huge tape recorders like a domestic fridge, and you'd have to carry them around with you. And some Russian scholars decided that they would leave tape recorders in people's homes and ask people to record themselves when they were doing things, when they were cleaning the house or whatever. And they got back a lot of data. But one of the tapes was very strange. There was obviously a technological problem. There was a loud hissing noise. And occasionally, someone would say, yes, no, not yet. Just a few words, and they couldn't understand it. So they said, we have to go back to this family and ask them what they were doing. So they did. They went back to the family, and they said, we have this tape, it's a hissing noise. What were you doing? They said, we were frying sausages. And you see the point, the hissing noise was the sausages in the frying pan. And there was very little language, because when you're frying sausages, you don't say, I am frying sausages. These sausages are for my dinner. When they are ready, I will take them out of the pan and put them on my plate. And then I will take my knife and fork and I will eat them. No, of course not. You get very little language when language is embedded in action. And that is when we get most of this omission of obligatory grammatical items. So, your teachers tell you all the time, no, you can't have a verb without a subject in English. An English verb always needs a subject. You always have to say, he does this, or I do this, I do that, You can't just say, quiero agua. You have to say, yo quiero agua. But that's not quite true. That's not quite true. So in situations where the language and the action are together, we can leave out many things, but not everything. You can't run into a room and say, oh, I'm late. Okay, so there are certain rules about it, certain conventions which limit how much and when and where you can omit these little pieces of grammar. But then let's stop and think. I think I'm guilty of an error, a big mistake. I'm talking about omitting language. But in conversation, nothing is missing here. There's nothing missing. The message is complete. It's 100% complete. So maybe we can conclude that when you write, you add things. That this is the basic grammar of human beings. You say the absolute minimum because the context, the situation tells you exactly what it all means. But when we write, we are writing texts probably for someone who's going to read it in a different time, in a different place, someone you've never met, perhaps. So you have to elaborate everything to make sure that everything is fully comprehensible. So it's not so much that these little utterances are missing something, it's that writing is adding it. And if you think of public notices, yeah, there was one in Cambridge, where I live. There's a shop that hired bicycles to students. And they had a notice on the outside of the shop, and it just said, no bicycles. No bicycles. Now, what does that mean? Don't park your bicycle here? No, it actually meant we have hired out all the bicycles. We don't have any left, okay? That's what it meant. And it was sufficient in its context. But of course, you can't do that with your academic writing. You can't do it, you know. You can't say Shakespeare, well, yeah, great poet. You can't write it, but you can say it. Shakespeare, great poet. You don't have to say Shakespeare was a great poet. This is a trick I've learned in Spanish when I don't know the gender or the how to end a tense. I just say nouns, and they normally understand me. They humor me, shall we say. Okay, so that's ellipsis. It's important because it facilitates context-embedded interaction, the relationship between language and the situation. It creates informality. So if you are in an interview for a job and one of the panel asks a question, you don't say, "You talking to me?" You might say, "I'm sorry, I didn't hear you." You probably wouldn't say, "Sorry, didn't hear you." Repeat that. No, you'd probably say, "I'm very sorry, I didn't hear you. Could you repeat that?" So it's a very informal type of grammar, but that's what you want. You want informality. You want to make friends. In this global world, you're going to travel. You're going to study in other countries. You want to make friends. You don't want to sound like a book, okay? And it creates this economy of expression. You don't need much language. Very good. We're coming to the end. Patience. I promise it's not far now. Freedom is coming soon. Now, one last thing before we finish, and that is that, of course, when we look at conversation, we find, in fact, that there's not much grammar in it at all. So I'm shooting myself in the foot now. I'm saying, given all these points about spoken grammar, and now I'm saying, when you look at a piece of conversation, there's not much grammar. Well, what do I mean? What I mean is that most of conversation consists of fixed, frozen chunks of language. A study by two linguists who are based in Sweden concluded that more than 50% of all of the words in an average conversation are part of chunks. They are frozen pieces of language. We don't create them grammatically. You know, we don't say, now, en este momento, how do I say that? Is it at or in? In this moment, at this moment? No, we just say, at the moment, at the moment, at the moment, at the moment, at the moment I'm not working. At the moment I'm not working. So at the moment is not created grammatically, it exists already. You take it from your brain, ready-made. Like this jacket, it wasn't made by a tailor. I took it off the hook in the shop. It's off-the-hook language. Now, the important thing about chunks is they have no internal grammar. We don't analyze them. We don't even know them. Little children learn them. So if a typical English-speaking baby, you know, the parent, the mother or the daddy says, you know, the plate is empty, says, all gone. And baby says, all gone, all gone. That baby is not thinking, here's another adverb and past participle. I must make a record of that. Of course not. Of course not. It's just a chunk, okay? And the evidence is that learners of other languages are very capable of using chunks that contain grammar beyond their current competence. There's a lot of evidence of this. The project, the English Grammar Profile, shows evidence of this, that even learners at A1 can say things like, I'd like to visit you. I'd like to buy a book. Okay, so they have no idea that it's conditional or anything. They just know that chunk. I'd like to, I'd like to, I'd like to. Now, one of the problems is that chunks may be 2 or more words in one language, maybe just 1 word in another, and vice versa. So obviously, sabes in Spanish is 2 words in English, you know. De todas formas in Spanish comes out as 1 word anyway. So there's no match 1-to-1 between languages. You have to learn the chunks of the other language. It's as simple as that. You have to learn them. And you have to learn how they work. And how they work is very special. Firstly, I said they have no grammar. But the important thing is you have to say them in 1 breath. You must not stop in the middle of the chunk. You can't, if someone says, well, what do you do for a living? Well, at the moment, I'm not working. It has to be at the moment, at the moment, at the moment. So you have to say it very quickly. And you should try this. You should mentally practice saying these chunks as fast as you can. The faster you can say them, the more you will be heard as fluent. Now, the other bits of language which are not chunks, you can take your time. You can relax. Okay, so if someone says to you, are you going out tonight? You might say, well, I feel a bit tired. You know what I mean. I feel a bit tired. You know what I mean. So the first part, I feel tired, can be quite slow. The second part, you know what I mean, has to be fast. Consider the alternative. Are you going out tonight? Well, I'm tired. You know what I mean. Very strange, isn't it? Yeah. Okay, so chunks fast, the rest slow. You must be able to do this in order to be heard as fluent. Chunks play a huge, important part in the perception of fluency. So that's the golden rule. Fast chunks, slow the other bits. But more than 50% of everything you say in conversation is chunks, without any internal grammar. Don't analyze them. Okay. Here are some examples of chunks. What we call prefaces. The only thing is, what I mean is, yeah? And you have these in Spanish, lo que pasa, yeah? Lo que pasa. And I tried to say that quickly, lo que pasa, pero se me traba la lengua, no? Lo que pasa. So you have to be able to do these quite fast. Projections of shared knowledge, you see. I don't think we share that knowledge. And everything, that sort of thing. So remember that first example, odd vegetables and things. That's a classic chunk. It doesn't have any internal grammar. We used to grow the odd vegetable and things. Response, I don't know. Yes, I know. I suppose so. I hope so. That's great. That's awful. All of these are things which nobody ever taught me when I was studying Spanish in the university. Now, I know things have changed now, but when I was a young student, we were taught thousands of words. I remember knowing 36 different words for types of hill and mountains. Okay? Wonderfully useful. But I didn't impress anybody with them, They were just like up there in the head. I never learned these things like, that's great, that's awful. No me digas. Ay, qué horror. I had to kind of pick it up on the street, Topic markers, guess what? X was telling me, I mentioned that before, I was reading in the paper, oh, there's in missing there, there's a word missing. I was reading in the paper the other day, do you remember blah, blah, blah? These are classic chunks for introducing topics. Politeness markers, interactional markers, do you mind if, do you mind if, do you mind if? I was wondering if, would you like to, would you like to, would you like to? And they have to be said very quickly. I'm going to finish now and just say a few words about attitudes to spoken grammar, because I've made it sound very easy, very simple, very straightforward, but it's not. Unfortunately, it's not. People have strong attitudes about spoken grammar. There's a huge public prejudice in the broadcast, in the press and in the media. Constantly, these telephone phone-in programs, there will always be someone who's complaining that, the beautiful grammar of English is going downhill because people are, not speaking correctly, or they're not speaking in the way that they write. And these are big problems. Worries among what we call stakeholders in education, parents, publishers, governments, exam boards. They don't like it. They often don't like it. It's very difficult to persuade them that this is what they themselves do when they speak. The number of times that I've addressed audiences like this, and people in the question session afterwards say, well, that's all very interesting, but I never say, you know. Yeah, it happens. People deny, they say, yes, that's what teenagers say, but, I would never say that, You know? Worries among educators, teachers like yourselves. Is it good English? Can I or should I teach it? How do I teach it? These are questions which are not totally resolved yet, but we have made a lot of progress. Lack of resources. How many resources do you have for teaching spoken grammar, spoken English? The reference books, all those published before 2006, don't contain this kind of thing. I know you're all wondering what was the magic that happened in 2006. I'll leave you to guess. But, it's an extra burden on teachers. My gosh, I have enough to teach. Now, next Monday, I have to go in and teach spoken grammar, as well as all these other things, reading and writing and listening and blended learning and interactional skills and I don't know what. So these are genuine problems which I hope you will be able to discuss in your own seminars and so on. And suspicion among learners. Learners will come to you with the expectation that you will tell them what the rules are for the formation of perfect sentences and paragraphs. And they will be worried and suspicious if you say, yes, of course you can say, you talking to me, or ready yet, finished yet. They'll say, well, why, is this a good teacher? Not so sure. I think I want to change to another class. These are genuine, real problems. Okay, where are we now? Well, there is a greater acceptance of the notion of spoken grammar in the applied linguistics community, that's for sure. Since Carter and I published our article in 1995, there are now a lot of articles and studies and research done on spoken grammar. It's a growing field. There are numerous descriptive articles. There is influence now on reference grammars, so, I'm sorry to do a little bit of self-publicity, but the grammar that Ronald Carter and I published in 2006, we put a lot of spoken grammar into it. And one of the benefits of studying spoken grammar is that we are more accepting of variety and variation. I came to Spain many years ago to teach English, and I'm Welsh, and I had, in those days, a very strong Welsh accent. But in the language school where I worked in Santander, the director said, we really want you to speak in a received pronunciation, like the Queen, So I had to change my accent. I had to go into class and say, good morning, everybody. And it wasn't natural for me. Now it doesn't matter so much. We accept variation. We accept the accents of people from all over the world, whether they are natives or expert users and so on. So that's a positive. And there's growing influence now in course materials and books. I mentioned my own works there, and a very nice text by Patterson et al. 2012. So it's coming into course books. And of course, now that we have multimodal corpora, we no longer have those big tape recorders like the size of a refrigerator. We now have video, we now have mechanisms for tracking gesture and movements. We can align physical gesture with video, with the sound recording. with a textual transcript. We can do it all now. The technology has vastly changed how we understand the relationship between grammar and speaking. Everything before was based on the analysis of written texts. Now we can do it properly thanks to technology. And of course, the other influence of technology is that it is blurring the division. It's breaking down that division between spoken and written. So emails, text messages, tweets, Facebook postings, they are much more like speaking than writing, even though they are written with a keyboard. So there is a kind of breakdown between the two. And we are now in a sort of middle territory between spoken grammar and written grammar. The division is not so strong anymore. I'm going to finish by returning to our original example and explaining why. In 2006, Carter and I published our grammar in England, and it created a huge public furore, a huge, massive, great row. And a British newspaper, the Daily Telegraph, published an article attacking me and my colleague. And the headline, big letters, was Grammar and Bad Manners. Okay, grammar and bad manners. And then there was this attack on these two outrageous professors who were talking about teaching our children to speak like teenagers in the bus shelter, the baseball cap. So I had a call from the BBC who said, can you come on and defend your grammar? And it was on a program, if you're British or you know Britain, it was the program called Today on Radio 4, which is a very important program and terrifying experience because, the day before they had interviewed Colin Powell from, the US Secretary of Defense, and they had presidents and prime ministers, and Rajoy has been on there and everything. So there I was, and they said, and they were phoning me during the night. I had about 6 phone calls during the night saying, we want you to come on at 7:30 tomorrow, and, would you like our researchers to find anything? So I said, yes. I said, I do believe you have a recording of a very educated person speaking English, describing his childhood. And I told them when it was and so on. They said, okay, we'll look for it. Then they rang back. They called me again. They said, we found it. I said, well, could you play that during the interview tomorrow? And they did, and I hope I did a good job of defending our position, because who was the speaker of this wonderful reminiscence of his childhood? Step forward, the Prince of Wales, Prince Charles, okay? It was Prince Charles who said all that. And my point was that even, Prince Charles is one of the cleverest, most intelligent people in Britain. I'm not going to call him an idiot or anything. He is fantastically clever. He is so clever that he knows exactly how to play the audience. He knows exactly how to come across as, I'm just one of you. I may be a prince, but really I'm your friend. I'm the person you have a beer with in the pub. I suppose, I don't know, when I was little, we were sort of gardening Buckingham Palace. We used to grow the odd vegetable and things. I'm just an ordinary chap, just like yourselves. There's nothing special about me. So he was he was using the spoken grammar to project this informality, this friendship. I'm just an ordinary chap. I'm one of you. Now, he also wrote in the Observer newspaper this text at the same time, and this was his written text. As a child, I loved growing vegetables at the palace. I suppose you could say, now he's got a object. I suppose what? I suppose you could say my interest in organics back to when I was a child, full stop. I remember the enormous pleasure I had from growing my own vegetables in the garden at Buckingham Palace and from being in the countryside. So this is the written version of that spoken version. So now you can see how different spoken and written grammar are. The same subject matter, the same theme, the same person. Speaking and projecting himself as a friendly chap, and writing in this rather formal manner. Okay, well, that's it. Thank you for listening. And there's the information.
Well, thank you very much, Mike, for I'm speechless. I know that I'm now going to be judged for my spoken English, so I'm not sure I want to say anything. But anyway, questions are welcome.
I hope I haven't terrified you into silence. Is that...
Do we know each other, I believe?
I think I vaguely recognize you, yes. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Okay, I was impressed. I really enjoyed your talk. I'm
Thank
a
you.
little bit puzzled here because you said there was no grammar in the spoken language, that there were chunks, and then suddenly we find a book that is called Spoken English Grammar. How can you explain that?
Yeah, Miguel, it's a conundrum, yes, it's a conundrum. I think the point is this, that of course there is a grammar in speech, but what has happened is that because face-to-face speech is immediate and online and not rehearsed and not corrected, the grammar has congealed, it's become frozen. The grammar is still there, and obviously scholars like yourselves may take a great interest in analyzing the grammar of chunks. So for example, if you take a chunk in English like by and large, which means por regla general, generalmente, yeah? By and large, it is grammatically anomalous. You have a preposition, a conjunction, and an adjective. Officially, you can't do that in English. So this might be a question of interest to yourselves. I think what I was trying to say was that what David Brazil said, for the ordinary person, the man and woman in the street, the notion of constructing clauses and constructing grammar is not a great burden because so much of it just comes congealed, frozen, already there in their minds. They don't have to think every word after word. Now, the problem for learners of second languages is, in fact, this is where the anomaly comes, Miguel, because you have to kind of construct more, and I think it's a kind of tension. That's my escape route from your question. Yeah. But I think that's the answer, that for the second language learner, you still find yourself analyzing, creating things word after word after word. But for the expert user and the native users, this is not a problem. Most of it is already there, frozen. And we just take out these. It's like taking out a ready-made meal from your freezer at home. Just put it in the microwave and there it is. Okay. Thank you, Mia. Any other comments or questions? Don't be afraid. I'm not going to bite your heads off.
I have a question.
Oh.
There you go. Tough. No, I was just wondering, usually or often I've heard you give advice to students about, how they could improve their vocabulary or their English. I was just wondering, because I'm the one to blame for Laura's anxiety about taking notes. I'm the one who asked them to do a task and, write down about 3 core features that you were mentioned, that were going to be mentioned in your lecture. So there you are. Now, I was just wondering, could you give them any advice about how to improve their spoken English?
I think there are 2, maybe 3, but 2 absolutely important things. And they're fairly obvious. Number 1 is just listen, 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 listen. Number 2 is rehearsal, mental rehearsal. You don't have to speak out loud, because if you talk to yourself, then the people in white coats are going to come and take you away. But the importance of mental rehearsal cannot be overestimated. In any quiet moment, sitting on the bus, during a boring lecture, but I know there are no boring lectures in this university, but, no, how could there be? But moments of quiet and relaxation, rehearse these things in your head. Say them 100 times. Think of them as pieces of music almost, and you will become more fluent in that way. The other thing is, don't be afraid. Speaking as someone who has tried to learn several foreign languages, you feel you have a duty to make good, correct sentences. If I start with a past subjunctive, then, somewhere I need a conditional, Don't know when it's coming, but somewhere I'm going to have to create a conditional. It's not like that. Don't be afraid to use very short utterances. Yeah? I think very often we say too much. We say more than we need to. If you can imagine yourself, they're speaking English. And you might say to somebody, would you like another coffee? Okay, that's fine, it's very correct, but it's also okay to say, another coffee? That's enough. You don't need any more. You could almost say, practice reducing your language. Don't think your goal is to expand it and to sound like, I don't know, Shakespeare or William Wordsworth. Your goal is to sound like a human being and not to sound like a robot. That's the goal. And I know that when I try to speak Spanish and Swedish, I sound like a book or a robot, and I'm not a very good robot, a robot whose battery is not functioning properly, And it's hard to cross that boundary, to cross that line. But try it. Try reducing what you say. Ask yourself the question, not how much do I need to say, but how little do I need to say? Do you think she's satisfied?
You passed. Do you have any more questions? What about my students who've been taking notes?
Is that Michael?
It is Michael, yes.
It is Michael. I'm Michael too.
Congratulations. I've really enjoyed your
talk.
talk. And I've been sitting here taking notes and thinking. And my question is really, it's about when we're teaching our students a new language, in my case, teaching English, that we feel that you have to teach the grammar first before the chunks. I remember years ago, the late Dave Willis, he came out with a sort of an idea that we ought to teach perhaps sort of language that you're saying, for example, the language that we actually use in the street, and he actually did a corpus of language which included everyday expressions and things. But I feel that perhaps didn't work very well in the English language classroom. It was too difficult for the students and too difficult to teach, perhaps because it was too varied and too vast, really. So my question is really that, are we still, as teachers, do we have to really start with the basic grammar and bring in, for example, the chunking, the conversational grammar sort of later as proficient speakers of the language? Do I make myself clear?
Okay, yes,
Michael?
absolutely, yes.
Oh, yeah.
Now,
Okay.
my response is this. In part, I agree with you. Okay, so the problem with learning any second or foreign language is that there is so much to learn. And you can't say, for example, well, we're going to start with grammar, but we're not going to worry about phonology and pronunciation. Because then you would end up with people saying, I am working in a new job, instead of working. So from the beginning, we're doing everything effectively. Now, in the past, from the beginning, we've always done grammar, pronunciation, and vocabulary. And all I'm saying is this, that from the beginning, we can also add chunks. Now, to do this properly, the problem is you need to know which are the simplest, most frequent chunks. And that's why you need a corpus. You can't just pull them out of your head because you're a teacher or because you're a native speaker or an expert user of English. I don't know what the chunks are. But what I do know is that the corpus can tell me that some chunks are so frequent that they are massively more frequent than what we consider to be the simplest everyday words. So the chunk okay, is the most frequent chunk two-word chunk in English. In our corpus of 5 million words, occurs 12,000 times. That's 12 times more than words like, I don't know, the colors or the days of the week. Yeah? So Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, relatively speaking, are rare compared with, and I mean, and I suppose, and I don't know. So I think it's a question of little by little. Of course, the mistake of the lexical approach in the 1980s, the Cobild, Willis, etc., that group, and Mea culpa, I was part of that team in the early 1980s. I worked with Sinclair and Willis and these people at the University of Birmingham. And we were very excited because we felt we had something new to say. The co-build course was published and, well, it sank like a lead balloon, as we say. And the reason it did was precisely what you're saying, Mike, and that is that it was too much. You couldn't just throw people in at the deep end. I think we've learned from those mistakes, and so now the best courses will, of course, introduce the present tense, the definite article, the prepositions. Will, of course, introduce the first most frequent 500 words. Will, of course, tell you the basic pronunciation of English, but also now the good ones will tell you the most frequent and most common chunks, but very simple ones. And the more complex ones will come later. So it's a grading system, just the same as with everything else. But I take your point, and it's similar to what Miguel was saying, you know, that this is a minefield in some ways.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Michael.
I think we should stop here. Thank you ever so much, Mike, for your lecture, and thank you all for being here.